At my sister's wedding in Napa Valley, under chandeliers glittering like gold, my mother pressed a glass of red wine into my hand. I am Madison Carter, the daughter she never wanted. The scent was sharp and metallic, wrong, in a way that made my stomach twist. I hesitated, then slid the glass toward Sophia, the glowing bride. She raised it laughing and took a sip. Minutes later, she collapsed on the marble floor, and 200 guests turned to me as my mother's voice cut through the silence, accusing me of ruining everything. The chandeliers above the ballroom shimmered with golden light, scattering across walls lined with white roses and silver drapes. 200 guests filled the air with laughter and the hum of polite conversation, their sequined gowns and tailored suits catching every glint. The clink of champagne glasses echoed against the marble floor, while a string quartet played from a corner. From the outside, it looked like perfection, a fairy tale unfolding in Napa Valley. I clutched my small purse tighter as I walked past rows of tables draped in ivory linen. Every name card bore the flourish of Sophia's chosen calligrapher. Guests leaned in, embracing one another, marveling over the beauty of the ceremony. When I found my place, my breath hitched. My card was tucked at the farthest table next to the swinging kitchen doors, where servers rushed in and out balancing trays. Each time the door opened, the clatter of pots and hiss of steam slipped into the ballroom, drowning the music for a beat. I smoothed the navy silk of my dress and sat down, telling myself it did not matter that it was only a seat. But it did matter. It always did. Even on the night that belonged to my sister, I was the afterthought tucked where no one important would see me. I watched as my mother glided through the room. Margaret Carter was a vision in emerald green pearls, catching the light at her throat, every step polished like she had rehearsed it. Guests stopped her to admire her dress, her grace, her perfect smile. She thrived under the spotlight the way Sophia always had. When she reached me, her smile cooled, as if she remembered she had left a chore unfinished. She set a single glass of red wine in front of me. The color was deeper than the others I had seen being poured. It clung thickly to the glass when I tilted it. My mother leaned close, her perfume heavy with jasmine, her eyes sharp despite the curve of her lips. "This is for you, Madison." Her voice was soft, but left no room for refusal. She lingered for only a moment, long enough for her gaze to pin me in place, then turned to return to the head table where Sophia sat in a halo of praise. I lifted the glass, my fingers trembling slightly. The scent rose before it touched my lips, and my stomach clenched. It was sharp metallic, almost like rust, and carried an acrid edge that burned my nose. I pulled back, coughing lightly, blinking away the sting in my throat. Around me, waiters moved gracefully, refilling glasses with wine from bottles. I recognized their fragrance, rich and smooth. This was different. Wrong. I whispered to myself, "This doesn't smell right." I set it down, my palm damp against the stem, my pulse hammered in my ears. Should I confront her? Should I push the glass away and risk her wrath? The inevitable cutting remark about me being dramatic, ungrateful. Years of her disapproval pressed down, reminding me how little space I had ever been given to question. My eyes darted to the head table. Sophia shone brighter than the chandeliers, her veil cascading like a waterfall, her gown sculpted to perfection. She moved with ease, surrounded by bridesmaids who fussed over her bouquet and gushed about her beauty. I envied her ability to smile without effort, to bask in love that was always offered freely. The scrape of her heels drew closer, and suddenly she was there, leaning down to me, her perfume mingling with the sour scent of the wine. Her voice was playful, mocking. "Why are you sitting all the way back here, Maddie?" "Because this is where they put me," I said, unable to soften the bitterness in my tone. She laughed under her breath, shaking her head as if I was hopelessly amusing. Her eyes flicked to the glass on the table. "What are you doing with that?" I hesitated, my hand tightening around the stem again. My chest felt tight. A warning pulsed through me, the same warning I had felt too many times before in this family. I thought of my mother's eyes, the way she had said those words. "This is for you." Like a command, like a trap. Sophia reached for the glass casually, her attention already drifting to her friends, waving her over. My heart pounded. I wanted to stop her, to snatch it back, to demand an answer for why it smelled wrong. But in that instant, I loosened my grip and slid it across the table toward her. "You might as well enjoy it," I said, my voice low, my throat tight. She took it without hesitation, her smile dazzling as she turned toward her bridesmaids. The crystal chimed as she tapped it against their glasses. She lifted it high, her laughter ringing radiant and sure of her place at the center of the universe. I stayed frozen in my chair, every nerve on fire, watching her tilt the glass. I held my breath as the rim touched her lips. Sophia's throat moved as she swallowed, and at first nothing happened. She laughed again, lowering the glass, ready to say something to her bridesmaids. Then her smile faltered. A small cough broke from her lips, then another sharper this time, and her hand went to her chest. I pushed back my chair instinctively as her face flushed red, then drained pale in an instant. The music screeched to a halt, the violin bow snapping against strings as guests gasped. Sophia bent forward, choking the crystal glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the marble. Red wine splashed across her gown like blood blooming on white satin. Nathan bolted from the head table, his chair clattering to the floor. He caught her just as her knees gave way, shouting her name, his voice cracking. "Sophia, stay with me. Look at me." Panic tore through the room. Guests stood whispering, then shouting, crowding toward the dance floor. The bridesmaids screamed, clutching one another, their bouquets falling in a mess of petals. The smell of roses mixed with the acrid tang of spilled wine. I stood motionless, my palms slick, heart pounding so loud I could hardly hear. My eyes locked on Sophia's body, limp in Nathan's arms, her head rolling back. The moment was surreal, like time had slowed, and I was watching through glass. Then my mother's voice cut through, sharp as a knife. She spun toward me, eyes blazing, fingers stabbing the air. "What did you do, Madison? What did you put in that glass?" The room went silent, except for Nathan's desperate pleas as he shook Sophia gently. "Call 911. Somebody call now." Dozens of eyes turned on me. Strangers, relatives, neighbors from back home. Their stares pinned me to my chair harder than nails. Whispers darted through the crowd like sparks catching dry grass. I shook my head, my voice barely finding its way out. I did not do anything. She took it from me herself. Margaret's expression hardened, her mouth a thin line. "Do not lie. I gave that drink to you. Everyone saw it." Guests nodded nervously, uncertain, glancing between her and me. Heat flamed up my neck, shame tightening my throat. I wanted to scream the truth, that the smell was wrong, that I should never have let Sophia take it. But my voice stuck as if sealed shut. A man in a dark suit, one of Nathan's groomsmen, pushed forward with his phone to his ear. "Paramedics are on their way. Hold her steady." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Some guests wept openly, others backed away as if illness itself might leap from her body. Waiters scrambled with napkins and water, their faces pale. The shattered glass glistened on the floor like shards of accusation. I felt the weight of my mother's glare, heavy and merciless. "You always envied her, Madison. Now you have ruined her wedding." Her words sliced deeper than any whisper. My chest tightened as if ropes bound me. I stepped back, stumbling against the chair behind me. I wanted to vanish, to disappear through the floor. A child's cry pierced the noise, and then the doors banged open. A team of EMTs rushed in, kneeling beside Nathan and Sophia. They lifted her carefully onto a stretcher, fitting an oxygen mask over her pale face. Nathan's voice trembled. "I am going with her. Please, she is my wife." The stretcher wheeled toward the exit, Nathan clutching Sophia's hand. Guests pressed back, giving way, murmurs rising in waves. My eyes followed until the doors slammed behind them, leaving a suffocating hush. Margaret's voice filled the silence. I saw her. She had the glass. If something was wrong, it came from her. A ripple moved through the crowd, suspicion hanging heavy. Faces blurred around me, judgment in every gaze. My stomach twisted. I wanted to protest, to shout that it was not me, but all I managed was a whisper lost in the noise. Someone touched my arm. I turned to see a waiter staring, his face uncertain, as if he wanted to speak but thought better of it. He slipped away before I could hold him. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration, but a courtroom, and I was already condemned. My mother stood tall in the center, the grieving matriarch pointing at the daughter she never wanted. I was the villain in their eyes, and I had no words left to defend myself. The murmurs grew louder, and I knew this was only the beginning. The guests trickled out in clusters, their voices hushed, eyes darting toward me, as if I carried something contagious. The music had long stopped, the roses on the tables suddenly wilting in my sight, their sweetness turning sour. A staff member began clearing plates that no one had touched, his hands shaking as he stacked silver cutlery. The ballroom that had glowed an hour earlier now felt cold, stripped of joy, heavy with suspicion. Someone from Nathan's family approached my mother and whispered. Then both of them looked at me as though I were a problem to be solved. Margaret's hand waved in my direction, sharp, commanding. "Madison, come here." I followed because disobeying her in front of others had always seemed impossible. My heels clicked on marble as she led the way out of the ballroom and into a private lounge off the corridor. My father Thomas was already there, sunk into a leather armchair, as if it might swallow him whole. His shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the floor. The door closed behind us, and the murmur of guests faded. My mother stood in the center of the room, still immaculate, though her pearls shifted as her chest rose and fell with controlled fury. She did not sit. She did not even blink. "You embarrassed this family tonight," she began, her voice cool and deliberate. "You have always envied Sophia, and now your jealousy has poisoned her most important day." My breath caught. I opened my mouth, desperate for words. "I never touched that wine after you gave it to me." She took it herself. Margaret's lip curled. Convenient. Always the excuse. Always the victim. I turned to my father, hoping for a lifeline for him to say he had seen what really happened. He stared at his shoes, silent, his hands clasped tight as if chained together. "Say something, Dad," I whispered. "Please." But he did not lift his head. My mother's voice filled the silence instead, sharper now. "Do you know what will happen if Sophia's name is dragged through this mess? Do you know what people will say about this family? About her marriage? About us?" The question was not really for me. It was her stage, her performance. I stood at the edge, unwanted, but essential for her to cast blame. She stepped closer, eyes like glass. "You were never supposed to inherit anything. You should be grateful Sophia carries the responsibility. Evelyn's trust fund is hers, as it should be." My chest tightened at the name of my grandmother. Evelyn Carter, the one person who had ever looked at me without judgment. I felt the air leave my lungs. Grandma left that trust for both of us. My mother's laugh was brittle. "You think so? You think she wanted her careful savings wasted on your foolishness? No, Madison, it is Sophia's. I will make sure of that." The words landed like stones, heavy and final. My fists clenched at my sides, nails cutting into my palms. I wanted to shout, to throw back every moment of favoritism, every cruelty, every time she had pushed me into the shadows. But in that room, with my father's silence and my mother's icy certainty, I felt 12 years old again, voiceless, cornered. The minutes stretched. Outside, I heard the faint siren of an ambulance fading as it carried Sophia away. The image of her pale face under the ballroom lights burned behind my eyes. For all our differences, I had not wished this. The guilt pressed down heavier with every breath. Margaret straightened her shoulders as if sealing the verdict. "You will not speak of this to anyone. Do you hear me? You will not drag Sophia down with your nonsense. If anyone asks, you say nothing." I swallowed hard, my voice hoarse. "And if I do not?" Her eyes narrowed. "Then you will regret it." The silence after those words was suffocating. My father finally shifted, but it was only to rub his temples. He never looked at me. I left the lounge with my knees trembling, my dress clinging damp to my back. The corridor felt endless as I walked, the voices of guests, now whispers that followed me like smoke. I could not shake the echo of her words about the trust fund, her claim that it belonged only to Sophia. It felt less like a declaration and more like a threat, a piece of a larger plan I had not yet seen. And deep down, I knew this confrontation in a side room was only a preview of what was coming. When I stepped back into the main hall, the air was thick with whispers. Clusters of guests had formed in the corners, their eyes darting toward me, then quickly away when I noticed. The glitter of the chandeliers no longer seemed elegant, but harsh, spotlighting me like an accused criminal. A few cameras were still out flashes, snapping quietly, as though someone wanted proof of the evening's scandal. Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs as she re-entered behind me. Her tone carried the weight of command, every word sharpened. "Do not be fooled. My daughter had the glass. If something was wrong with it, she is the reason." A fresh wave of stares pinned me in place. My mouth opened, but before I could force a word past the lump in my throat, a man's voice rose above the noise. "That is not true." I watched her. She never touched it after it was set down. The room shifted as if pulled by strings. Heads turned to see Charles Davenport, tall in a charcoal suit, his expression calm but firm. Everyone knew who he was, the CEO of Sentinel Systems, a name whispered with awe in the business world. He stood at his table near the front, his hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, as if steadying the room itself. I froze, stunned. He had no reason to defend me, no obligation to risk his reputation in a crowd that wanted a scapegoat. Charles continued, his voice steady, measured. I was watching when Margaret placed the glass in front of Madison. She lifted it, smelled it, and set it back down. She did not drink. She did not tamper with it. Sophia picked it up herself. That is what I saw. A collective murmur rippled through the hall. Some nodded. Others frowned, torn between the authority in his tone and the fear of contradicting my mother. Margaret's face hardened. Her lips pressed so tightly together they whitened. She stepped forward, pearls gleaming under the light, her eyes burning with fury. "You are mistaken, Mr. Davenport. My daughter has a history of jealousy. You cannot rely on her behavior as innocent." His gaze did not waver. "I am not mistaken." The tension swelled thick enough to choke. A woman nearby muttered that she had also seen Sophia grab the glass quickly, though her voice faltered when Margaret turned toward her with that cutting glare that silenced people. I felt a tremor of relief, but it was fragile, fleeting. My mother would not let this go. Then Ryan Mitchell, the family's longtime acquaintance and a respected civil attorney, cleared his throat from where he had been standing near the exit. His presence had been quiet until now, but when he spoke, the hall stilled again. "It would be best," he said evenly, "if speculation stopped here. The paramedics have Sophia. The hospital will run tests. Until we know what is in that glass, assigning blame helps no one." His words carried a lawyer's balance, neither absolving nor condemning, but the effect was undeniable. The noise settled into uneasy silence. Margaret bristled, her chin lifting. "So we should allow her to smear her sister's name unchecked." Ryan's eyes flicked to me briefly, then back to Margaret. "What we should do is wait for facts. If something harmful was present, the investigation will determine how and why." Charles inclined his head slightly toward Ryan, acknowledging the sense in his words, but his gaze returned to me. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, just enough for me to breathe again. Still, the unease in the room lingered. Guests looked between my mother's righteous fury, Ryan's calm logic, and Charles's firm defense. The verdict was not settled, and I remained in the center of their doubt. My hands shook as I folded them together, willing them still. The humiliation of being accused before 200 people had left a mark that would not fade with one man's defense. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice, though it still carried. "Do not think this changes anything, Madison. People will always believe what they saw, and they saw you with that glass." The words crawled under my skin, icy and deliberate. I wanted to shout that it was her who placed the glass in front of me, her who set me up, but fear and exhaustion kept my mouth shut. Charles shifted slightly as if he might speak again, but Ryan raised a hand to hold the room in calm. "Enough for tonight. Let us wait for results." Margaret's glare lingered on me a moment longer before she turned, the emerald fabric of her gown sweeping the floor like a warning. Guests began to disperse, though their glances still clung to me like smoke. I remained near my chair, breath uneven, my pulse refusing to slow. Charles spoke briefly to someone near him, then left with an air of finality, as though he had said all he needed. Ryan moved toward the exit phone already in his hand, likely contacting the hospital. I stood alone, the fragments of Sophia's shattered glass still glistening on the marble nearby. The night was not over, and the truth had yet to be uncovered. By morning, the headlines had already spread across California. Wedding in Napa Valley ends in chaos. Bride collapses after toast. Photos of Sophia in her gown, eyes half closed, and Nathan clutching her arm were splashed across news sites. My name appeared in the margins, always attached to Whispers, the younger sister, the one holding the glass. I sat on the edge of my bed in my small Seattle apartment, the blinds still drawn against a gray sky. My phone vibrated constantly, messages from coworkers, former classmates, even strangers demanding answers. I could not bring myself to reply. Every notification felt like another stone hurled at my chest. By midday, Ryan Mitchell called. His voice was calm, professional, but I heard something in it that steadied me. "The initial toxicology results are back," he said. It was not just wine. There was a strong irritant mixed in, something that could trigger a severe reaction. "She is stable now, but it explains why she collapsed so quickly." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "So it was not just me imagining the smell." "No," Ryan confirmed. "You were right to hesitate. But the public does not know that yet. And Margaret is already pressing her version of the story." My stomach twisted. Of course she was. Ryan paused, then added, "I have requested access to the venue's security footage. It will matter." The next day he called me again. His tone carried a spark I had not heard before. "The cameras show Margaret taking the glass from a tray, holding it briefly, then setting it in front of you. You never touched it again before Sophia picked it up." I closed my eyes, relief and fury colliding inside me. Proof. Finally proof. But Ryan's words continued heavier now. "That is not all. I also pulled Evelyn Carter's trust documents. Your grandmother added an unusual clause, a safeguard. If Sophia became entangled in any scandal or public disgrace that harmed the family's reputation, the trustee had discretion to redirect funds to the alternate beneficiary. That alternate is you." I gripped the phone, my breath sharp. "So Grandma thought of me." Ryan cleared his throat. "Margaret never mentioned this clause to anyone. I suspect she intended to bury it to make sure Sophia inherited everything without question. This incident could shift control of over $1 million. The room spun slightly as the weight of it landed. My mother had not only tried to humiliate me, she had motive to silence me entirely. That evening, the news ran again, this time, including leaked details of the toxicology report. Words like contaminant and tampered flashed across the screen. Images of the broken glass glimmered under police lights. Reporters speculated about foul play. My phone rang again. This time it was my father. His voice was thin, as if each word cost him. "Madison, do not fight your mother on this. Let it go." I swallowed hard. Let it go. After she accused me in front of everyone. After she tried to pin this on me when she put the glass down herself. Silence hung before he said quietly, "You do not know what she is capable of." I nearly laughed, bitter and sharp. I know exactly what she is capable of. When the call ended, I sat in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. For the first time, I understood the depth of the battle. It was not just about jealousy. It was about control money and a legacy my grandmother had meant to protect. Ryan texted later that night, "I have arranged a meeting with the trustee to review the clause formally. Be ready." I turned off the light and lay back, the city humming beyond the glass. My chest still carried the echo of my mother's accusation, but now there was something else threading through the fear. Proof and the possibility of justice. The hospital lights were unforgiving, bright and sterile, reflecting off the polished linoleum as I walked down the corridor. Sophia was propped up in a bed, pale but awake, her hair tangled against the white pillow. Nathan stood at her side, his hand resting loosely on the railing, his eyes distant. When he saw me, his jaw tightened, and he did not greet me. My mother was already there, sitting tall in a chair by the window, her posture rigid, her voice clipped as she spoke to a nurse. When she noticed me, she turned away as if my presence did not matter. Sophia's lips parted. "Maddie." Her voice cracked thin from the oxygen she had been given. I stepped closer, unsure if she wanted comfort or confrontation. "I am glad you are awake," I said quietly. Nathan's eyes shifted to me, then back to her. He looked like a man weighing choices, a groom questioning the vows he had spoken only hours before. His silence hurt more than any accusation. Reporters had gathered outside the hospital, their voices muffled through the glass cameras, flashing whenever a doctor passed. News vans lined the street. On the television in the corner, the headlines scrolled relentlessly. Napa Valley wedding disaster. Bride collapses after suspicious drink. Nathan finally spoke, his tone calm but edged. They are asking questions I cannot answer. They want to know how something like this happened, why the glass was different. My mother snapped before I could respond. It happened because Madison cannot control her jealousy. Do not let her twist this. Nathan's gaze flicked to her, then back to Sophia. His hand slipped from the railing. His doubt was written plainly now, not hidden. Ryan entered, then his briefcase in hand, his expression grave. He waited until the nurse left before he spoke. I have reviewed the documents with the trustee. Evelyn Carter wrote a protection clause into the trust. If Sophia becomes part of a scandal that damages the family's reputation, the assets may be reassigned. The air in the room froze. My mother's head snapped toward him, her pearls rattling as she rose from the chair. That is absurd. That clause is meaningless. Ryan shook his head slowly. It is not meaningless. It is binding. And in light of what has already been broadcast, the trustee has grounds to reconsider the distribution. Sophia pressed her fingers against her temple, her eyes glassy. Mom, is this true? Margaret's face hardened. Do not listen to him. This is nothing but manipulation. Ryan continued unshaken. The public coverage alone is enough. This wedding is being called a scandal across state lines. That qualifies under the terms. If it continues, Madison becomes the primary beneficiary. The words hung heavier than the scent of antiseptic filling the room. My heart pounded, but I stayed silent, afraid to break the moment. Nathan stepped back from the bed. His voice was flat, now resigned. So everything about this family is a performance. First the collapse, then the lies, and now money at the center of it all. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her fingers trembling as she reached toward him. Nathan, please. But he did not take her hand. Instead, he turned toward the door, leaving without another word. The sound of his footsteps fading down the hall felt like the end of something far bigger than a wedding. Margaret glared at Ryan, her fury barely contained. You had no right to bring this here. Ryan met her eyes steady as stone. I had every right. And this is only the beginning. I felt every gaze shift toward me then, my mother's burning with hatred. Sophia's clouded with betrayal, Ryan's measured and careful. For the first time, the possibility of a different future was real, and it terrified them more than it terrified me. Ryan called a meeting at the trustee's office 2 days later. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper lined with shelves of leather-bound binders. Margaret arrived first, her emerald scarf knotted perfectly, her eyes flashing with the same fury that had carried her through the hospital corridors. Sophia followed, her complexion still pale, her steps unsteady. Nathan nowhere in sight. My father trailed behind them, silent as always, his face a mask of exhaustion. I sat across the long mahogany table, my palms pressed flat to keep them from shaking. Ryan spread out documents in front of us, each page marked with neat tabs. The trustee, a gray-haired man with a calm demeanor, adjusted his glasses and waited for Ryan to begin. Ryan's voice was steady. We have reviewed the security footage, and we have reviewed the toxicology. There is no question the drink was tampered with, and now we have further evidence. Margaret's lips tightened. You are wasting everyone's time. Ryan slid a document across the table. This is correspondence uncovered in the trust's records. Margaret Carter attempted to persuade the trustee's office to quietly remove the protective clause Evelyn Carter insisted on. She argued that it was unnecessary and outdated. The trustee nodded gravely. We did receive such requests. We declined them, of course. Evelyn's wishes were clear. Sophia's breath caught. Mom, you tried to change Grandma's will. Margaret's face flushed, then hardened. I was protecting our family. That clause was a liability. Ryan placed another page on the table, his finger tapping the signature. This shows Margaret went further, attempting to file an amendment through a third party without legal standing. That is fraud. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rustle of Sophia's dress as she sank back into her chair. The trustee folded his hands. Given these findings and given the scandal that has already damaged the Carter name, the trust will reassign primary beneficiary rights. Madison Carter will receive control of the majority of the assets effective immediately. The words seemed unreal. I stared at the trustee, then at the stack of papers that now spelled out a future I had never dared to imagine. Margaret surged to her feet, her voice rising. "This is outrageous. You cannot do this. She is reckless. She is jealous. She will squander everything." Ryan's tone was quiet but sharp. "The documents do not lie. Evelyn chose her safeguard for a reason." Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears, her hands twisting in her lap. First, her wedding had dissolved into chaos, and now the fortune she had always believed hers was gone. She looked at me as if I had stolen her life. I met her gaze, my voice low. "I never asked for this." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Of course you did. You have been waiting your whole life to take what belongs to Sophia." I pushed my chair back slowly, forcing calm into my voice. "What belonged to me was dignity. And you tried to strip even that away." The trustee raised his hand, signaling the meeting was over. His decision was final. Margaret stormed out her heels, striking the marble floor like gunshots. Sophia lingered a moment longer, then followed her shoulders, trembling. My father stood last, his eyes flickering toward me with something unreadable. Perhaps regret, perhaps resignation, before he turned and left as well. When the door closed, the silence was almost too much. Ryan gathered the documents, sliding them into his case. He looked at me, then his expression softened. "Justice takes time, Madison, but today it found you." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with everything I wanted to say. By evening, the news had already broken. Reporters swarmed the street outside my building, shouting questions. The story shifted from the wedding collapse to the exposure of fraud within the Carter family. Margaret's name was dragged across headlines, Sophia's fall from grace dissected in every outlet. Commentators who once admired their wealth now mocked the hypocrisy. Inside my apartment, I sat by the window, watching the glow of cameras below. For the first time, I was not invisible. I was not the family's failure or the scapegoat. I was the one holding the legacy. The weight of it was heavy, but I carried it in silence. The true battle had only begun, and I knew my mother would not retreat quietly. I packed my suitcase quietly in the early morning, the hotel curtains still drawn, the scent of roses from the ruined wedding faintly lingering on my clothes. Napa felt poisoned now, every corner a reminder of humiliation and betrayal. I drove north with the windows cracked, letting the cool Pacific air wash the taste of it out of my lungs. By the time the skyline of Seattle appeared through the fog, I felt lighter, though the weight of inheritance still pressed against me like something both earned and unwanted. Charles Davenport called 2 days later. His voice was steady, measured, as if he were negotiating one of his billion-dollar deals. "I saw what happened, Madison. I do not like injustice, and I do not like wasted talent. Sentinel Systems could use someone with your eye. Creative director. Think about it." I pressed the phone close, stunned. For years I had been told I was nothing, a shadow at family gatherings, a mistake in my mother's story. Now someone who had watched from the same ballroom where I had been shamed was offering me a seat at a table of power. I accepted before I lost my courage. Within weeks, I was on a plane again, this time to San Francisco. The Sentinel Systems office rose in glass and steel above the Embarcadero, sleek and modern, humming with the rhythm of invention. I walked through its doors carrying not just a portfolio, but a name suddenly tied to scandal and inheritance. Charles shook my hand in the lobby, his eyes calm and reassuring. "Welcome home," he said, as if I had always belonged. I threw myself into the work. Campaigns branding creative visions that once filled sketchbooks on my bedroom floor now filled conference rooms overlooking the bay. My team looked to me for direction, and I gave it my voice, steady where it once trembled. At night, I returned to a furnished apartment near the waterfront, the city lights spilling across the waves. The trust fund transfer completed quietly in the background, though the press never stopped circling. I used part of it to establish a foundation in Evelyn's name focused on supporting young women in creative industries, women like me who had been told they were not enough. Writing the first grant felt like speaking directly to my grandmother, promising her that her faith had not been misplaced. One afternoon, my father appeared at the edge of the foundation's opening event. He wore a simple gray suit, his shoulders smaller than I remembered, his eyes tired. He did not approach the podium or the cameras. Instead, he waited until the crowd thinned, then came to me with his hands clasped. His voice was low. "I should have defended you." I nodded, unable to summon words. For years I had begged for that sentence. Now that it was spoken, it felt like an echo rather than an anchor. Sophia called weeks later. Her voice was softer, brittle with regret. "I miss you, Maddie. We are still sisters." I listened, pressing the phone against my cheek, staring out at the skyline. Part of me ached for the little girls we had once been sharing secrets under a blanket. But too much had happened. Too much had been torn open. I answered carefully. "I hope you find peace, Sophia." She cried quietly, then hung up. Time moved forward, relentless. My days filled with work, with plans for the foundation, with the sound of the city that had become mine. At night, I often stood at the window of Sentinel's top floor, looking out at San Francisco glittering against the dark water. The reflection of lights in the glass reminded me of that ballroom chandelier, but now the glow belonged to me, not to anyone else's shadow. The past still lingered like a bruise, but each day it faded, replaced by something sturdier. Freedom, power, and the knowledge that I had survived what was meant to destroy me. I thought often of Margaret, of her fury, and her silence after losing everything she tried to control. I knew she was not finished, that her pride would not let her vanish quietly. The city outside hummed with life, but somewhere back in Oregon my mother was plotting her next move.